in that same building, in a previous class, we had this one instructor who I think wishes he was a boot camp company commander.
Gonzo, the Coast Guard Years, New York, Episode 6. Boot Camps and Graduation.
My class, not that I had any class, we're all talking about where they were going, and it seemed everyone was pretty happy for the most part of where they'd been assigned. Everyone but me, that is. I still hadn't yet processed the fact that I was headed to a big white one in the future. Honestly, I couldn't describe just how upset I was. But I kept it mostly to myself. Rafa, well, he was doing his very best to keep my spirits up about the whole thing. Also, I needed to keep myself focused because we were headed to our last, or gearing up for our last ET class. We will be working on a real piece of equipment, not some crazy mock-up device thingy. The class was held across the street from our barracks and up on the top floor, I think it was, which I think that would have made it a 3-story climb, if I'm recalling correctly. In that same building, in a previous class, we had this one instructor who I think wishes he was a boot camp company commander. I'm not 100% sure how this all went down, but I remember he had us form up in front of our barracks like we were in boot camp, but kind of like a lazy boot camp sort of thing, so boot camp like. It was more like how we formed up when I was on the Thetis. It was, as I said, it was boot camp-like formation, but not nearly as squared away. I don't recall if he made us march across the street, but I wouldn't be surprised if he made us do that. He was very much a stickler for the rules, such as no pack of cigarettes in your front shirt pocket, no hands in your pockets at all, unless you were working on a piece of equipment. Now, real quick, the reason I mentioned that you couldn't have a pack of cigarettes in your front shirt pocket was because, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I used to smoke like a long time ago. Not that there's anything wrong with anyone who smokes, but anyway, okay, so I don't know why I even said that. So you couldn't have your hands in your pockets unless, like I said, unless you were working on a piece of equipment. The theory was, or the reasoning behind this was, it was to minimize accidental grounding and ultimately reduce your chance of dying from electrocution, which seemed like a sensible precaution. You know, it occurred to me as I've been doing this podcast that the things or people that impacted me the most, apparently still to this day, are the things that I remember the best. Having said that, I don't seem to recall much about my time in electronics school. It was basically get up, go to class, go back to the barracks, eat, study a little, sleep, and do it all over again. However, one of the things I did remember, well, mostly, is a story that I had heard from one of the Coasties in the class ahead of us. He was a prior Air Force, and he never tried to pretend that Air Force boot camp was tough. He was one of those prior service Coasties that was able to avoid the real Coast Guard boot camp. The story he told us was apparently from an issue of U.S. News and World Report. He had read an article about the hardest/toughest U.S. military boot camps. Now, let me just say, none of us had read this article, so he could have made the whole thing up. But I also remember this was back in the late 80s, and clearly a lot has changed since then. So, before you start rolling your eyes at me and talking smack, I am preemptively saying to you, chill the fuck out and just listen. I promise you, you'll think it's funny at the end. Okay, so ranked hardest to easiest. Oh, and one last thing. This list was way before the newly formed Space Force. You know, every time I say that, I think of that. So there was a TV show out when I was young, and it came back, and then it didn't last very long. The Muppets. But when I hear Space Force, there was an episode in the TV show The Muppets called Pigs in Space. So I always think about that, the opening to that skit that they would do. So when I hear Space Force, I think Pigs in Space. Oh, or there was a cartoon, I think it was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and if I got that wrong, I apologize, called Space Ghost. Space Ghost. So when you hear Space Force, from here on out, you're going to be thinking Pigs in Space or Space Ghost. So Space Force. Yeah, sorry, guys. I you know what? I don't know why I did all that. I apologize. So now, hardest to easiest. Obviously, the first one, the hardest one, was the Marine Corps. That should be obvious, right? The second was the Coast Guard. I know you're as shocked as I am. Then there's the Army, the Navy, and the fifth, which, of course, there's only one left, the Air Force. And according to the guy telling the story, when he saw the list in U.S. News and World Report, it had a note in parentheses next to the Air Force. It said, "Remember to bring your tennis racket." As I said, none of us besides the storyteller had seen the article. I don't even know if such an article was ever written by U.S. News and World Report, but it was still a funny story to listen to. So, also, one of the things that was kind of a blur, mostly a blur, sort of a blur, was the graduating class before us. Now, if you remember Ron, the guy from Missoula, Montana, during his class celebration time, he was kind of walking around the barracks, sort of, I don't know, randomly, aimlessly. And I bumped into him, which was also kind of a random thing because I was basically randomly walking around the barracks. I guess it was a weekend and I had nothing better to do to just wander around the barracks. Ron, I think, was a bit tipsy when I met up with him. And he was, you know what, he was always really funny and he had this really low-key sense of humor that was mostly sarcastic, but in a cool, mellow way. It's kind of hard to explain, but if I had to describe it, it was more like a stoner, surfer, hippie kind of humor vibe. And sorry, Ron, if you're listening to this, but it's like all said with love, man. That's me channeling my inner Ron. So anyway, Ron came up to me and asked what I was doing. And of course, I said I wasn't up to anything much. And just like that, I was putting on a sweater. Yes, I wore a sweater. Shut up. It's like this big white, off-whitish, thick cotton thing. Anyway, I think I bought it at a store called Britch's Great Outdoors. I don't even know that store even exists anymore. But anyway, so I put on a sweater. We started heading out. We took the ferry across to South Ferry, which is South Manhattan. And actually, that was the name of the stop, I think. The last stop on the Red Line was South Ferry, the number one at least. And then we just kind of started walking around. I had no idea where we were going. And I wasn't even sure Ron knew where we were going. I did know we were somewhere in the financial district, which is about it. We walked into what I would call, well, it's not a grocery store that I grew up around, but there was like a handful of these things kind of scattered randomly about. They're like tiny little grocery stores. When we went in there, we bought 2 40s of Budweiser beer in bottles. I think they're bottles, I'm pretty sure. The cashier, of course, put them in separate brown paper bags. They were just big enough to cover the bottles. I'm pretty sure these bags were specifically designed for this particular, activity we were about to do. We were basically brown bagging it, but not like taking a brown bag to like a lunch or something like that at work. We were walking around the streets like a bunch of the other stupid idiots and bums and tourists too. I think tourists did that. Maybe not. Maybe it was just me and Ron, but normally when you saw people walking around the brown paper bag on the streets, everyone knew what you were doing, and it's not like you were hiding it. So basically you were the idiot thinking you were hiding it, but maybe it was just we were hiding from I'm sure it was probably a loophole in some New York City law we thought we were getting around. Anyway, I don't remember what happened next, but pretty sure we ended up at the village at some point, and we just kind of walked around, and I think Ron was mostly stumbling around. And Ron, I think, had Boilermakers during his class celebration. So I didn't know what a Boilermaker was, but Ron sure liked to be drinking Boilermakers. But I faked it like I knew what he was talking about. And for those of you who are wondering, a Boilermaker is basically a shot of whiskey. I prefer bourbon, of course. And basically in a pint of beer. You drop the shot into the pint of beer, and then you chug the whole thing down. That was it. I mean, I guess it was a really quick way to get loaded. And supposedly you had to do it all in, one big gulp, or, I don't know. Because I don't know if I ever had a Boilermaker. Maybe I did. I don't remember. Regardless, we just kind of roamed around the streets of the village for a bit and then went back to Governor's Island. I know, that was super exciting, right? You thought I was going to lead up to some crazy story, but that wasn't the last time that Ron and I would take a little stroll through the village. But that will be for next season. Next season. You see what I did there? Now you have to come back to find out what Ron and I got up to. A few days later, most of the people in the class ahead of us were gone. The barracks were like crazy quiet, which was super weird because they were rarely ever quiet. We were and by we, I mean our class, my class, we were in our last module, and we were working on, again, I mentioned previously, I think it was a radio, and we were going through our troubleshooting of it. The thing about that class that stuck out the most were the three instructors. I mean, they each had their own different personality, of course, but the one that really stuck out was the E6, the Petty Officer First Class, the ET1. He was the dude in charge. I don't think I ever saw him smile or even heard him laugh, up to this point in our class with him. I kind of always thought he was just another grumpy, strict asshole of an ET that thought we didn't deserve, or rather that I didn't deserve to be an ET. I mean, it's not like I had any run-ins with the guy at all. I mean, I didn't. It was just an impression that I had of him during our final practical test. As I said, they gave us a radio to work on, I think, and each piece of gear, each one of us ETs in the class had our own a piece of equipment. Each one of them had a separate thing that was wrong with them. The radios, not the ETs. And I'm pretty sure they did that so, we couldn't actually cheat. Because it's not like we would cheat. Well, we may have, or would have, that is. But it's not like the class was quiet, because we kind of all were kind of talking to ourselves, and it's what weird, odd people do. In case you guys are wondering, we weren't having like casual conversations with each other. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. During the troubleshooting, they taught you to do troubleshooting like in sections. So as you got to a particular point in your troubleshooting, you were supposed to stop, take your results of where you currently were up to one of the instructors to be reviewed. During that review process, they would tell you if you were on the right track, or they would start asking you questions about stuff and quizzing you, and then you knew you were screwed and you had done something wrong. But it's not like they would do it in a mean way. They did it in sort of I'm going to guide you and lead you to the answer so you can go back and do it again, which was always cool. So now with that little background context out of the way, one of the times that I took up my work to get reviewed, I was going to, I wanted to get it reviewed by the cool instructors. There were a few students already ahead of me who were lined up with the cool instructors, the other two. And I'm like, oh, shit. So I kind of eased in behind them, and I probably was trying to hide behind one of the other students so I can get the cool instructors. But no, that is just not my luck. The ET one saw me and called me over, and you know what I was thinking. I'm just thinking, fuck him. This is going to suck. He was having a conversation with the cool instructors while they were reviewing other people's work. It's not because they already knew all, like, it wasn't like they had to like really concentrate very hard to review people's work. But again, I came up in the middle of the conversation, so I didn't have a lot of context of what they had been talking about. But I do remember one of the cool instructors was talking about someone else's father who had passed away. And of course, the other cool instructor said something that you'd expect, like, well, that's a shame. I'm sorry for the family. Then the ET1 spoke up, and with like this deadpan, monotone demeanor about him, he said, why are you sorry? What if the guy was an asshole? He looked up at me, and of course, I was like, I can't believe this guy actually said that. But he looked up at me, and he kind of smiled. And it was the weirdest thing, because I don't know if he was some sick, twisted, sadistic bastard, or just actually funny as hell. I'm pretty sure it was a little bit of both. And the moral of the story is, not really the moral of the story is, but thankfully I ended up passing that class. And that was that. All that was left for me and the rest of my class was graduation a few days later. I'm not entirely sure what day graduation day was, but what I remember about that day wasn't something I'd expected to happen. As we all kind of marched in, I think it was single file, into the room where we would be receiving our promotion to electronics technician third class, the room, oddly enough, I was a little disappointed, was mostly empty when you first walk in. There were only a few people actually involved in the ceremony. And the part that I didn't expect at all, my younger brother and sister and our uncle were sitting there in the front row. Honestly, I couldn't believe that they were there. I don't even remember telling anyone about graduation. I probably did. I just don't, I probably had forgotten that I had told anyone about it. Honestly, I was confused too of how they even got there. But I was also pretty happy that they were there too. So putting all that aside, I might have really sucked at electronics, but I was the only one who had family to come to the ceremony. So bonus for me. As we were marching in, I could hear the other ETs behind me sort of whispering. And I remember my family was smiling at me, which, if I'm being honest, it was a little embarrassing, but it was still really cool all at the same time. I don't think I really conveyed to my family how much I did, and to this day appreciate that they were there. It was really cool. The ceremony was pretty simple, and like most things at AT school, my memory of the ceremony is pretty foggy. I don't remember what it was said. I don't remember anything, not even the slightest. What I do remember is when the ceremony was over, and yes, I know I've said ceremony like a zillion times, so whatever. So when it was over, we marched in the same way that we'd come in, except this time we had our third class petty officer collar devices, or insignia, whatever the kids are calling it these days. It was a pretty proud moment for me. One of the instructors, so a few of the instructors were hanging out in the hallway. They weren't part of the ceremony. As we're filing out, marching out, they were congratulating us and saying all kinds of really nice things. And one of the guys was out there saluting us. It was in kind of a weird sort of mocking sort of salute. kind of like, if any of you ever watched Benny Hill, he was a crazy, funny British comedian. I won't get any more into that because I go off on some weird tangent. But Benny Hill had this really weird salute that he would do during his bits. So it was kind of like that. So this instructor, the one we all liked, was the one doing something funny like that. It was hysterical. I mean, it wasn't like it was funny. We expected that from him. And, he's also the instructor who would call me the big kahuna. I think that during class with him, when he would ask questions or talk to me directly, and I guess it's just the way I responded was just sort of, he thought I sounded like a surfer dude, which clearly I was not a surfer dude. I could body surf, but that's about it. Anyway, he just did it just to mess with me. It wasn't like in a mean-spirited way. It was all good. He was funny. He was cool. We liked him a lot. So later that afternoon, I met up with my family. I'm not exactly sure how we met up or got together, but we ended up going and doing a quick tour around Times Square. Of course, I asked Rafa to come with us, and he and I acted like we were New York City experts. I mean, compared to my family, we were. But really, we didn't know much. We'd only been there like 3 months, and we always had Crosby with us to sort of show us around. So all the ETs, or at least most of us, were leaving in a couple of days. I know I was leaving in a couple of days. So I was headed out with my family, and after I left New York, I was headed home, hang out with my family, and then I was off to Boston. So it was a good idea for all of us to get one last tour through New York and whatnot. So that's why we were out there in Times Square, mostly for my family, but who knew when I was going to be back to New York? I hadn't the foggiest idea. I don't remember if we all went to dinner later that night, but what I do remember is that my sister and uncle kind of hung out together the most. I'm pretty sure my uncle was just, trying to be overly protective, and it was my younger brother who hung out with Rafa and I. So whatever. So the first day was out and done. The next day, my brother Rafa and I met up with Crosby. We hopped on the number 1 red line and headed to Christopher Street, the Village, because Rafa and I wanted to hit the Village one more time before we all parted ways. I don't remember what day exactly it was, but what I do remember, as we were coming up from the subway onto Christopher Street, we heard lots of different sounds. It was loud. There was shouting, not like in a weird, not like in a violent way, but it was something you'd hear at a stadium, and horns honking and people. Well, it sounded like a party is what it sounded like. So we could hear all that as we were leaving or coming up the stairs from the subway. And when we got to the street level, it couldn't have been more perfect for the Village. There were people lined up on both sides of the street watching as a line of parade floats with people on them going by. We had arrived in time to see part of a pride parade of some sort. I don't know if it was actually Pride Day, but it was a pride type parade. Man, I don't know why I had a hard time just spitting all that out. People were all dressed up in wild and different colors, and some people had, barely wearing anything, I guess. People on the floats were waving and shouting at spectators and blowing kisses to everyone, and I don't remember if they were throwing candy or not. I probably would have remembered if they were throwing candy, because that probably would have been, I probably would have got some of that. Anyway, the look on my brother's face was priceless. I don't know if it was shock or confusion or just plain old, what the fuck is going on here? I remember Crosby, Rafa, and I looking at my brother and laughed a little. I'm not sure who said it first to my brother, but we all took turns saying, "Welcome to the Village."
You've been listening to Gonzo the Coast Guard Ears, written and produced by Tim Gonzalez, and I'm Nicholas Gonzalez, the voice guy. Join us next week for another episode of Gonzo the Coast Guard Ears.